Atrocity does lead to atrocity. There are indications that the Americans did start shooting Germans. Who knows? Again, we weren't there. Certainly, it is true that black soldiers, because the American army, of course, was segregated, and a number of black soldiers certainly were shot. In fact, there's a monument to some shot, some executed black soldiers, and there was no excuse for that. You know, they weren't trying to run away. They surrendered. They were prisoners, and that was purely racism, really.
Yeah.
You know, dislike of blacks.
What they don't expect, as in the place at Wiltz, where there's a farmhead, a company of American soldiers, and this happens in other parts of the battle, a company of American soldiers facing a whole Volksgrenadier division says, we're not going to fight, we're not going to surrender, we're going to fight you. And they do. And okay, they get overrun, they get killed. But this amazing courage suddenly emerges from soldiers who've not only been battered in the Hurtgenwald, but are now being battered by the SS and the Wehrmacht.
Hello. In this second and concluding episode of our special on the Battle of the Bulge, it is Christmas Eve 1944, and the German advance has run aground as US troops counterattacked, and the weather cleared to allow the resumption of Allied air superiority. Joining to discuss are two acclaimed military historians, Gordon Corrigan, author of The Second World War, A Military History, and Philip Blood, author of War Comes to Aachen, as we cover the Germans in US clothing, atrocities and murder, and finally the battle's legacy for both NATO and the current conflict in Ukraine. Coming up, I have our film club on Saturday, and it's Apocalypse Now, Francis Ford Coppola's Vietnam masterpiece. Over Christmas, NAM Roger joins to discuss the naval history of Britain. Helen Carster talks Richard II and Henry IV. And then we head into the new year and the Mafia and the Kennedys, what we can expect from a Trump presidency, and some ancient Greek history with the Sicilian expedition. So please do share with family and friends over the Christmas break, and if you can give a kind rating, I would be most grateful. But until then, it's the Battle of the Bulge with Gordon and Philip. Philip, Gordon mentioned that it's, miserable conditions on both sides. Presumably, I mean, there's a story in this battle where the Germans actually dress up as American. Is there a unit that does that?
If you go back to the strike battalions, there was a unit that was put together under Otto Skorzeny and a fair number of the Abwehr troopers. And their aim was to wear American uniforms to create chaos behind the lines of the US Army. There's different views on whether that was successful or not, or just added to the overall confusion. But the fact that you've got these men operating behind the lines, in addition to which is often forgotten about, there were these special paratroop units like von der Heide's airborne unit, which dropped behind American lines to also fight as ordinary soldiers in Luftwaffe uniforms, Luftwaffe controlling the paratroops in those days. And the idea was to create as much chaos behind the line as possible. There's also something else. If they were in touch with the main troops, they could advise the troops on the condition of the US Army. And that's why this information that was coming back, especially in the case of what was happening in Bastogne, was so critical for the Germans, because while the British and the Americans have got their issues with, the code breaking, one of the reasons why they're having difficulties with code breaking and intelligence at this stage of the war is because the Germans are using normal telephones. You're not going to hear anything. Yeah. If General A talks to General B on the German telephone network, what are you going to hear? Nothing. And that basically shuts down intelligence gathering for the Americans and the British for a long time. They don't really get it back like they had done. And it's one of the reasons why, Bletchley Park kind of fades in this part of the campaign. The Germans, on the other hand, because they've had these troops on the other side and they have seen the Americans up close and personal, they've been passing a huge amount of information back on the quality of the fighting. So they know that they have equipment which will give them a very good chance against the Americans, and they know that they can put up a good fight. What they don't expect, as in the place at Wiltz, where there's a farmhead, a company of American soldiers, and this happens in other parts of the battle, a company of American soldiers facing a whole Volksgrenadier division says, we're not going to fight, we're not going to surrender, we're going to fight you. And they do. And okay, they get overrun, they get killed. But this amazing courage suddenly emerges from soldiers who've not only been battered in the Hurtgenwald, but are now being battered by the SS and the Wehrmacht. Suddenly, out of nowhere, these American soldiers are finding an unusual level of courage and stubbornness in the fight. I mean, the thing that struck me was not so much what Piper was doing, driving his tanks into a cul-de-sac. It was more interesting how the Americans were responding. And I think they were coming out of this far better soldiers than they'd gone in. You're literally experiencing a learning curve against this enemy. So you've had them all run back and they're all frightened and everybody's scared and blah, blah, blah. We know that part of the story. The other side of the story is suddenly the Americans are not only fighting back, but they're learning to fight better. That's a more interesting situation.
What is it that the Americans learnt there, Gordon? Is it that, okay, so you're going to get a ferocious German attack? Is it you sort of somehow you have to hold on and then there will be an opportunity to counterattack?
Every soldier, believe it or not, every regular soldier, not necessarily conscript, every regular soldier you want to be shot at. And the reason you want to be shot at is that your training, you think that, I think back to when I was a second lieutenant, I wanted to be shot at. And when I was delighted. It didn't hit, but because you believe that all your training will prepare you for dealing with that, but you don't actually know until it happens. And when it does happen, and you don't panic, and you don't go to pieces, and you do actually know what to do, that gives you a tremendous amount of confidence. And that applies to all ranks. Private soldiers, exactly the same. And I think when these chaps discovered, who had never been in combat, discovered that actually it wasn't as bad as they thought it might be, and they could actually identify what was happening, that gave them the I suppose the inner courage to actually fight. And of course a lot depended on the officers. Those units that were well officered tended to resist and fight. Those units that weren't so well officered tended not to. But I think it's a psychological thing. You if you survive one bit of combat, then you're much more prepared for the next bit, and you learn on the job if you like.
And one thing I've learned from these conversations and from others in other time periods is armies are kind of judged by the quality of their non-commissioned officers, the sergeants. Were the American sergeants particularly good?
The American system is rather different. The NCOs in the American Army don't have anything like the power that they have, for example, in the British Army. Officer cadets in the British Army are trained by colour sergeants. I mean, there are officers there as well, but the bulk of the training actually at Sandhurst is done by colour sergeants. That's not the case at West Point, where the instruction is given either by senior cadets, and of course, remember their course is a 4-year course, or by officers. Whereas the British Army makes a very definite distinction between corporals and below and sergeants. Sergeants have their own mess, their own accommodation. They're separate. They are the bridge, if you like, from the officer and the other rank, from the soldier. And I think British regiments probably pay a lot more attention to the NCOs, perhaps, than necessarily is the case in the American Army. I mean, the American Army, a company is actually run by the company commander. In the British Army, it's run by the company commander and the company sergeant major. So there is a difference. But again, the better the leadership is all the way down. If you've got a good corporal, a good sergeant, etc. I mean, all this seeps through to the chaps at the bottom.
And how about on the German side, Philip? Is that pretty much the same thing? I mean, the strength of the sergeant, I think, is quite famous in the German army, isn't it?
The German army, it's the NCOs are almost the spine. They run the whole thing. The officers tend to be a bit distant. Um, they leave the sergeants to make the decisions or the NCOs to make the decisions in combat. Very few officers lead by example. Um, what's interesting with certain things that I found with the British intelligence papers when I was examining the interrogations of German soldiers and NCOs, what came out of several reports was an interesting comment that if the sergeant decides to fight, it would be very tough. The Germans would fight hard and it would be very tough. If a sergeant decides to surrender, then that would be it. They'd all stop.
Yeah, I think the difference too is that in the British Army, a platoon, the smallest unit, 30 men, 35 men, has always been commanded by an officer to train the officer. You don't need an officer to command 35 men. Whereas in the German army, platoons were commanded by NCOs, and the NCOs had higher command level than they did in the British army. And as I say, the logic was British army officer commands a platoon really to train the officer. German army, as Philip says, platoon would be commanded by a sergeant.
And what struck me actually from having visited certain war graves is how the German officers are not buried with their men, are they? They're buried with other officers. That's certainly what I saw in Casino, whereas the British and the American dead are buried mixed together. Am I wrong about that, Philip?
If you look at certain famous graves like Model is buried alongside two ordinary German soldiers. Wittmann is also the famous SS tank commander. If I'm not mistaken, his grave is with two ordinary soldiers too. The problem that you have is after the war, the grave service, which had been originally part of the Wehrmacht, had been central to the German army going back to imperial times. So there was a grave service. All that facility kind of broke down with the end of the Wehrmacht in 1st of June 1945, when the whole of that military structure was literally taken apart. I mean, it's a long time after the war had ended, but they needed it to administer so much. They took away the grave service, which meant the Germans had to find an alternative, and you now have this volunteer organization which cleans up the graves, which finds bodies, which sets out cemeteries. And you'll find in Poland and Russia, some of the places where I used to visit quite often, a lot of the graves have been only created in the last 20 years. The cemeteries have only been created in the last 20 years. And of course, a lot of the burials are either actually in a plot, which may or may not be the soldier, but mostly these days they just turf all the bodies into a huge pit and have a great big block with the names of all the men that are known to be in the plot. It's incredibly sad. If you go to German cemeteries in the East, you very rarely find anybody who's ever visited them. If you go to the graveyards in the Ardennes, and I must travel the Ardennes battlefield every year, as long as I've lived in Germany, and probably almost every summer when I was living in Britain, and visiting the graveyards, having seen virtually all of them now, I think. It's interesting the differences. The French and the Belgians bury Germans differently from how the British bury them, and British servicemen buried in a French graveyard look more French than they do British, although lately they've been replacing the slabs of stone with Commonwealth War grave slabs, and there's no specific plan, no set way of doing these things.
No, I must say, I agree with Philip that the German cemeteries I've been to, which have been quite a few, the officers are buried. There's no distinction of rank. I mean, you'll find a stone, four names. One will be an officer. The other three can be other ranks. I don't think there was any attempt to separate the officers, as indeed there is not in the British cemeteries either.
Many graves And of course, with the Germans, their ranks are removed.
Yeah, the SS, the only way you can tell SS graves is from the rank. If you happen to know SS ranks, they've taken the SS runes are not shown.
No, but a lot of the graves now in the East, they don't even have the rank.
Oh, in the East,
Just
yeah,
the name. Totally depersonalized.
yeah.
They're fulfilling a process of ceremony for the bodies, and there is a service. And if
Mm.
families, if they're contacted, are asked if they wish to come along. But generally speaking, this is mass burial by the state for the sole purpose of just burying the bodies for the state.
Okay, well, that was an interesting little interlude. So just going back to the battle. I think what I'm getting is that by around about the sort of 26th, 27th of December, the German thrust has kind of run out of steam. Is that the timing? Have I got the timing about right there, Gordon?
Yes, I mean the thing goes on into January, but
Yes.
really it's as far as the Germans are concerned, they've shot their bolt, and it's then a process of the Allies getting their act together. And there is, of course, the period where the Eisenhower has given Montgomery command of those units north of the Bulge. Now that was a perfectly sensible thing to do. It didn't please the Americans. Montgomery, I'm afraid, didn't handle it terribly well. I mean, he gave the impression that he saved the Americans bacon, which, given that it was an election year in America, was not really a very sensible thing to do. I mean, the whole business of Montgomery's relation to the Americans is a separate subject, but actually dividing the command made sense. North of the Bulge under one commander, south of the Bulge under another commander. But by the end of December, the Allies have got their act together. The weather's cleared. They can use aircraft, and what they're trying to do now is to push the Germans back.
It would be great to say that the British saved the Americans bacon, but that's not actually the case, right?
No, it's not.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show. Philip, what are the Germans? Are they sort of still plugging away in the vague hope that they can get something out of this, or keep some of the land that they've taken? What's their thinking when they know they're not going to get to Antwerp?
Well, by the evening of the 19th of December, they already know they're not getting anywhere. Then there's a rash of discussions over what they're going to do. And the general opinion is, and it's not just Hitler's opinion, is we're here now, we might as well see it through. So some bog down and fight. What's interesting is if you look at the strike troops, people like Skorzeny and Joachim Peiper, because they're now fewer in supply, they are taken out of the fight and returned back to their main divisions. And that's important because the National Socialist regime, if it's going to continue doing this kind of operation, which it does several more times, especially in the East and especially in Hungary, it needs these kind of soldiers to lead the affray. You lead the attack because they're that kind of two-day wonders that will strike through. But the rest of the troops, they then settle into this kind of a semi-siege scenario of holding their Bulge. But it's also interesting that the Allies, instead of trying to pinch off this Bulge, which you would have thought commanders like, Patton or others would have insisted on doing, but they don't. They seem to want to push it back one German battalion at a time. And that is enormously resource heavy. You're actually losing a lot of troops. And so what you actually find is a lot of the non-battlefield casualties, the guys with the frozen feet, the gangrene hands and what have you. Those things are happening from now, because what actually happens is it's not the weather at the very beginning which is a problem. It's the weather that starts to deteriorate at the back end of December going into January. And suddenly the winter becomes really vile. And at the same time, the American troops have been put into this situation. And if you listen to the field artillery lads, who are reasonably behind and should be getting at least some supply, they have not got warm clothing. So they are actually in quite a disastrous situation, because although the Americans have got this remarkable supply system for battalions to get reclothed and resupplied and resupported, that stuff just literally has not come through. So
Not even by early January?
No, it's still not coming in large enough numbers, because it's all backed up with everything else. If you're trying to defend a battle, what comes first? Petrol or clothing? Well, I'll tell you now, it'll be clothing that goes in the back, and it'll be the petrol and the ammunition that goes in the front. So there's a fair old battle. Now, the other thing that happens with the Germans is the Tiger tank actually was built as an assault tank. This idea that it was a defensive tank is not true. The whole process was it was going to carry a fight further, but when the tanks went forward, they could fight hard, so they could take lots of punishment. So if you look at the way Michael Wittmann, the German tank base, or Karel, these guys, when they're fighting, they go out there and they expose themselves to enemy ammunition, and they literally take a load of punishment using the Tiger tanks to force the enemy back in a counterattack. What you actually get now is that the Germans are using what's called a Sturmgeschütz, which is an assault gun without a turret, in defensive fighting. And it's this old vehicle, this old self-propelled assault gun from 1938, which suddenly comes back into its own. So yes, the Six Panzer, the Mark Tiger version 2 has done a reasonable good job pushing forward, as the Panthers and the Mark IVs, but it's actually the old assault guns which hold the defenses. And they are very, very difficult to hit, especially because they're low level. They have a gun. If they're surrounded with infantry, if they're supported with infantry, they're very difficult to dislodge. And the Americans have got to somehow force these Germans out of their foxholes, out of their defensive positions, and keep pushing them back. And it's just not easy. It's a really vicious fight. And all the while, coming into this, to make the viciousness even worse, is the Americans are now beginning to learn about the massacres against their soldiers in places like Malmedy and Verwolf.
Right. Well, we haven't mentioned that. So what happens here then?
Well, in the strike, I didn't really want to go down too much on this, because I seem to be the one who brings all the bad news all the time. But the problem is with Piper is he's had a history of committing quite extreme actions wherever he's put into fighting. And he's been told not to take prisoners. You're a strike force. Prisoners are not your priority. You just got to push on, because, and it's all the same with any assault troops. If you're running on a clock and the time is running out and you've really got to do what you've got to do, you can't be wasting your time with prisoners. And it sounds harsh, but that's actually the reality of war. So Allied soldiers in assault will not always take German prisoners and vice versa. Unfortunately, what happens with Piper is he takes a lot more prisoners than they expect. And there's these bunches of troops. And one is a group of soldiers who are executed, possibly by a soldier within Piper's Kampfgruppe who decided upon himself to just clear them, turned the machine guns on these guys and killed, I think, 82 of them. The problem is they were buried in snow and ice, and of course it melted, receded. They saw this, and the Americans then started to hear the stories. Now, when you'd had similar happen to British soldiers and Canadian soldiers in Normandy, Montgomery said, no, 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 we're not having that going round fueling aggression amongst the troops because you lose control. Bradley went the other way. He put the messages round that American soldiers were being executed willy-nilly by all these men in the SS. The Americans went the opposite way. In addition, the Americans had also discovered the Germans had made propaganda films against their black soldiers. So when the black soldiers of the American Field Artillery Unit, which was captured with many of the 106 soldiers, they were filmed close up and personal and attacked for their racial qualities. Yeah. And that fueled another side of animosity towards the Germans. So you've got this counter reaction. So the Germans have thrown this extreme violence at the Americans and have not taken prisoners. And at the same time, they'd killed civilians, by the way, and including families of civilians whose children had been flak gunners defending Aachen. German families. They actually shot German families because they happened to be in the way of their vehicles and tanks and what have you. So Piper has gone in there and he's unleashed this horror of violence. But then you find that there's been other incidences. Schnell Group Kittel took out 11 black soldiers and killed them at Verwolf. And there's more and more of this. And I think somewhere in the end, you've got like 3,500 civilians and soldiers are murdered by the SS.
That's an extraordinary number, actually, isn't it? I mean, I guess not by the East standards. It's not.
Well, you can't really compare. I don't really like comparing that because one's fueled by a different kind of logic. But if you look at what actually then has been happening since about 2000 in the area, this my area here, people have been starting to look at the way certain groups of bodies have been discovered, and there have been claims that the Americans started to kill German troops in small groups. And I think that kind of bled into this vicious fighting, which of course we know by the time the Americans, especially the airborne chaps in your favorite TV series, they go to a concentration camp and see the horrors of the Nazi system, and the British released the people from Belsen in March 45. These stories now suddenly change the attitude of the Allied forces in the West to fighting the Germans in a different way than had happened. And it all starts really when the Americans are shown the pictures and hear the stories of what's happened at Malmedy.
Right. So, Gordon, we're getting to the end of the conversation, but is that an element of the battle then that...
Malmedy, the Americans, of course, a great deal has been made of the Malmedy massacre, including the fact that initially the Americans said that the bodies had been mutilated by their eyes being taken out, and then they discovered actually it was birds and not people at all. The thing with Malmedy, up to that, in fact, the prisoners had been treated properly. They'd been sent back through the normal chain of command back to the prisoner system. But of course, there hadn't been quite so many. Malmedy, they had taken, I think it was 100 and something prisoners in a field, and Piper himself went on because I think his next village was Langerville. And what I think may well have happened, and I can imagine it happening, you've got a whole lot of prisoners milling about. You've got the minimum number left behind to guard them, probably under an NCO. It's possible that one prisoner or two legged it, a sentry perfectly properly shot at them, which you're entitled to do if a prisoner's escaping. You then got panic, and everybody starts shooting. And then they realize, crikey, what have we done? And then they put the ones that haven't been killed, have been wounded, they knocked them off to make sure they haven't been killed. The trial rather of Piper after the war is interesting because he wasn't there, and he was able to say, look, I wasn't there, I'd gone on, and that was pretty well established that he wasn't. And he did say that if he'd been there, it wouldn't have happened.
Well, he would have said that, wouldn't he?
Who knows? Yeah. Who knows? You know, unless you talk to somebody who's there, and we haven't. We just don't know. And, you know, atrocity does lead to atrocity. There are indications that the Americans did start shooting Germans. Who knows? Again, we weren't there. Certainly, it is true that black soldiers, because the American army, of course, was segregated, and a number of black soldiers certainly were shot. In fact, there's a monument to some shot, some executed German black soldiers, and there was no excuse for that. You know, they weren't trying to run away. They'd surrendered. They were prisoners, and that was purely racism, really.
Yeah.
You know, dislike of blacks.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. I knew that they shot American troops, but I didn't know black soldiers had been killed. So what do you think? I'll ask both of you just as we're finishing off now. What do you think the legacy of the Battle of the Bulge is then today? Because it's a major event. I mean, more than maybe D-Day for the Americans, that is. D-Day is obviously a big deal, but then surely the Bulge is huge. Even more than sort of the invasion of North Africa, Operation Husky as well. The Bulge is a major commemoration for the Americans, isn't it, Gordon?
Yeah, it was the biggest American battle on the Western Front, bigger than the crossing of the Rhine, bigger than the Hunterton Forest. Um, they they try to paint it, and you can understand why, as a great victory against overwhelming odds. In fact, it was an absolute disgrace to begin with, but then they did sort themselves out. I think the thing that if I was their PR people, the thing I would concentrate on was the way Patton was able to turn his whole army round, which, if facing east, was going to go east, turn it all the way round to face north, a whole army, and get up to relieve Bastogne. When quite possibly by the time he got there, actually Bastogne was going to be okay. You know, they'd managed to try to beat the Germans off themselves, but nevertheless, it was quite a feat of Patton to be able to do that, and it was typical, of course, of Patton. I mean, he told Eisenhower, he said, "I can be on the way in 3 days," and everybody said, "No, quite impossible." But in fact, that's what he did, and gloss over the initial couple of days when there was bad leadership, a lot of surrendering, throwing away weapons, and all this sort of thing. They will gloss over that. Every army has disgraceful episodes, including our own. But certainly in modern American mythology, the Battle of the Bulge was a great victory against an underhand and deceitful enemy.
And Philip, the Germans, this is their really last throw of the dice, isn't it, on the Western Front? Am I right in saying that?
That's a defender's dilemma. You're going to do you know the last cause is it's the last resort, is the last cause. The legacy of what's happened is quite interesting. Living here, I perhaps see it more than others. This time of year, actually throughout the whole year, Bastogne is populated by people in American uniforms. Yeah. Which surprises a lot of people. On the 13th and 15th and 14th of December, there will be parades of American armored vehicles through the city. There might actually be one or two Germans. There'll be some reenactments. But if you were to drive on the 16th of December, when it was a Saturday or a Sunday, from Liège to Bastogne, 9 times out of 10, you would be overtaken or in convoys of jeeps, American trucks, and all of them were most of all of them were Belgians reenacting the US Army.
Yeah,
it's a huge business. But there's a second legacy in all of this, which, I mean, for my sins, I've been interested in this battle since 1969. So I've been going annually many times a year, sometimes, especially during the summer when I wanted to look at a certain battalion's operations. If you look at the way the battle has developed in the history, it's the one battle that NATO wanted to fight. And it's really fascinating how many NATO officers have gone on battlefield tours or staff rides, as they call it, on this battlefield, looking to take this as the dogma for maneuver warfare in NATO. And it always strikes me odd that this chaos is somehow being returned in a way that somehow NATO is going to save itself from the chaos of the politicians who are running it now to the Allied armies fighting a huge defensive against the Russian hordes. So you get this reenactment of the battle within Allied NATO doctrine, which becomes dogma, which then finds its way into the military history.
Is that something that's being employed in Ukraine today? Because it seems, you've got tanks and
the number. I mean, it makes me laugh. I mean, I wrote a book on Ukraine, talking about why maneuver warfare isn't going to work because you're in forests and mud and it doesn't work very easily. But what's fascinating is the number of people who've written books about the Ardennes who've tried to talk to it towards what's happening in the Ukraine presently, or in similar kind of battles that have taken place, as in the maneuver warfare in Iraq, which of course then bogged down in the insurgency. And the problem is with maneuver warfare is, the Germans had maneuver warfare for 2 days. The Allies had maneuver warfare for a long period of the war. The Russians seem to have maneuver warfare, but at the very end, you get down, it's about fighting and whether you're going to defeat the enemy. And I just find it very interesting that a battle then becomes twisted. A historic battle with all of the limitations of that war being now imposed on modern war with modern missiles, modern drones, modern equipment. I just find that fascinating.
Okay, Gordon, last word to you. I think.
Yeah, the people we wanted to talk to during the Cold War were not the people who not Jochen Piper and people like that. We talked to officers who'd been on the Russian front. And what we were saying to them is, look, after Stalingrad, you still managed to hold them back for what, 2 and a bit years. How did you do it? Because we may have to do the same thing. That's what we were looking at, really, was the Eastern Front rather than. I think there's also confusion about the term maneuver. Maneuver warfare doesn't just mean moving. It's a psychological concept. And it says you tell the junior commander what you want to achieve, and then you let them get on with it. In other words, you tell them what to do, you don't tell them how to do it. And this is a concept which the Germans always had, and which the British Army still having problems coming to terms with. So it's much more than just the ability to move. It's a thinking thing as well. In other words, tell somebody what you want to achieve, let him get on with it. Don't try and tell him how to do it. You can only do that if you've got an army that has been trained to use its flexibility, use its initiative. That's really what matters.
Well, both of you, this has been a fantastic, hugely influential battle then.
Can I just say I disagree with that? But never mind.
Well, I disagree with you, but I mean, let's just agree to disagree.
But you had the first word. Surely I should have the last word.
Well, no, I can tot up the amount of time you both had, and I'm sure it'll be equal. Thank you both. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Thanks very much, Ollie. Thanks, Gordon.
Thanks, chaps. See you soon.
Have a good Christmas.
Thanks so much for listening. If you can give a kind rating, I'd be really grateful. And please do share this pod over the Christmas break with your family and friends. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.